I'm going to talk about why psychedelics what do psychedelics tell us about the mind. I should say I'm speaking on as part of the Philosophy of Psychedelics research group at the University of Exeter. We've got a conference coming up and a book coming out this year. And also, don't tell anyone, but we've got some modules, philosophy of psychedelic modules for undergraduates and perhaps postgraduates coming up in the pipeline as well. Anyway, yeah, I'll try to be quick. Two parts really to this. First of all, I'm just going to talk very briefly about why the mind is still a mystery. And secondly, I'm going to give you about 12 questions or points or issues related to the mind and psychedelics. So firstly, I just want to point this out. The mind is still a very large mystery. Since Descartes' time, really, since the sort of 1600s, this has been a big problem. It concerns the relation between the mind and the body, or mind and matter. The modern expression of this is the so-called hard problem of consciousness. That was coined by David Chalmers in 1995. But it's an old problem. You get it, it's also called the epistemic gap, and it's related to Leibniz's mill. It's a big issue, and it hasn't been solved. A lot of people think it's been solved, but no one really agrees. And that's why we get this Science of Consciousness conference every year and so on. In fact, the word consciousness was a bit of a kind of woo-woo word in the 20th century. I mean, the scientists wanted to avoid it. They didn't want to look at it, which is a real pity, because in the 1960s, when psychedelics emerged in the sort of Western zeitgeist, philosophy and science were really reductive. They said, well, there's no such thing as consciousness. I mean, many people said that, and some people still do. And it's very interesting to see the neuroscience on consciousness, especially in relation to psychedelics, as we saw from David. In fact, David and I are writing a paper together, trying to sort of fuse neuroscience and philosophy in a way. But I just remind you of this this point from a great philosopher of mind called Jae-Gwon Kim, who died a couple of years ago. He wrote this, quote, "Making a running list of psychoneural correlations does not come anywhere near gaining an explanatory insight into why there are such correlations." So the neural correlations present rather than resolve or explain the problem. Why is meat and mind basically related? And what could that relation be? Could it be emergence? The mind emerges out of matter. This is prevalent view today. How about mental causation? Can the mind affect the body, desires, calculations, intelligence, and so on? Is the mind and the body identical ultimately? And in what sense? Or does mind and matter interact, as Descartes believed? Why do we have the specific experiences we do have? Why colors and sounds and whatever, rather than something else that would be just as practical? Why can certain mental states be realized with different physical bases? For example, can a machine realize consciousness, or potentially? Can a plant to a basic degree? Can a cell to a very basic degree? These are open questions. Anyway, so there's that. And even when we have a full neuroscientific understanding of the brain and its relationship to psychedelics, if that's possible, the question still remains, why is there a relation? Now, that's the first part. The second part is, well, what do psychedelics help us with regard to understanding the mind? William James, the great doctor, psychologist, philosopher, I know David likes him as well, he heralded psychedelics as means by which we could expand our understanding of the mind. I completely agree. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give about 12 points which sort of address the question as to how psychedelics do, what they do have to tell us about the mind. So firstly, very basically, to start with, psychedelics reveal that the mind, the human mind, can be extremely powerful. Far more than can be imagined. I mean, the high-grade psychedelic experience is far more than dreams, far more than hypnagogic hallucinations, far more than imagination, unless you're someone like Blake. perhaps. You can experience excessive beauty, excessive sublimity, amplified emotions, but also you can experience synthetic qualia, let's say. You can experience completely novel states of mind, nothing akin to what you have previously experienced. And that's, of course, one reason why William James says such experiences are ineffable. They cannot be put into language. Also, of course, they show that we have more powerful access to memories than we normally have. And they can give us then this extra qualia, these extra novel forms of experience. So that's the first point. They're not just pretty kaleidoscopic colors. I mean, they can be, but there's much more than that. And I think a lot of people think that psychedelics just sort of give you that, you know, but it's so much more. Number two, psychedelics, they make a mockery of certain scientific and philosophic theories which deny the existence of consciousness. So like I said, in the 20th century, consciousness was not a particularly scientific or fashionable term. And you had expositions like logical behaviorism and eliminativism, which said that, you know, consciousness is just really an illusion. It just really refers to like how you behave and so on. But of course, with psychedelics, you might not behave at all. You might be just completely motionless bodily, but your mind is traveling at excessive speeds. Thirdly, they provide a spotlight to investigate phenomenological questions about the duration and oscillation of the species present. So it's a very interesting question about in philosophy and metaphysics and philosophy of mind about what the present is, the present moment. It can't be simply a point, because then you wouldn't have a present, you know, you just have the past and the future. It must be of a certain duration. Is that duration always the same for one person, or is it always the same for different species? It seems that with psychedelics, that species present can be extended or contracted. What does that mean about what's real? We say that, you know, the present is real, but the past is not real. You know, Julius Caesar, we say, does not exist. But if the species present is only subjective and can be changed with psychedelics, that changes our view of the reality of the past, present, and the future. And also, I mean, it tells us a lot about timelessness, but I'll get into that in a moment. 4. They show that certain supposed necessary conditions of consciousness are in fact not necessary. So a number of philosophers say that, well, one necessary condition for the having of consciousness is intentionality. Like you always have to think about something, or you have to desire something, or you have an emotion about something. It seems that's disproved basically directly through psychedelics. And a number of other philosophers say there's no such thing as non-conceptual consciousness. Everything that enters our mind must be put into a conceptual framework. I think that's, I mean, that doesn't seem necessary at all when you think about excessive doses and extreme substances like 5-MeO-DMT. That seems to be gone completely. 5, they show that the human perception of space need not of necessity be Euclidean or 3-dimensional. There's very interesting reports about 4-dimensional, 5, 6, n-dimensional space on especially NDMT. Some philosophers like Kant, for example, said that, you know, space must be 3-dimensional. Aristotle said that originally. It doesn't seem to be that way. And of course, mathematically, we can talk about n-dimensional space without problem. But to actually perceive that, to imagine space of, let's say, 5 dimensions seems impossible. Maybe it is not impossible. 6. Psychedelics might fortify, amplify our notion of the extended mind. So there's a theory that the mind doesn't only consist of the brain and the body, but it can be extended outwards. That's part of our mind. That's part of the correlations of our mind. If you extend this, I mean, that's a big issue you can talk about for many hours in itself, but it makes one wonder whether the mind is restricted to the body, or can it extend into its object? It's very good that David mentioned Huxley, and I'm very glad he said, and I've got a quotation, I've got a screenshot of it, he say, psilocybin proves Huxley and Blake right. I mean, Huxley in the Doors of Perception famously said, you know, I saw these bamboo legs and I became those bamboo legs, subject and object became one. Now that's generally seen as a delusional side effect of mescaline or whatever it may be, but could there be actual truth in it? Maybe we've got a whole understanding of the mind's relation to matter wrong. Could there be some reality to that? This coheres nicely with Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy and Bergson's philosophy. Huxley, by the way, based his theory of mind on the philosopher Henri Bergson, who I can talk about if we have time later. 7. Yeah, do psychedelics, I added this just briefly, do psychedelics prove Huxley and Bergson, their argument that brain activity receives and reduces consciousness rather than that the brain produces consciousness? So the emergentism, which is has been popular in the West since the 1970s, says the mind emerges out of the brain. How about if it's not like that at all? How about the brain as a receiver? Psychedelics interfere with that receiver, and thus we don't get the sort of focused program, as it were. This is something, this is a big question that we can go into later, but it's very interesting to see David Nutt's neuroscientific work on that. 8, a full extension of the subject's mind to everything would be a typical example of the unio mystica. So Eddie was talking about religious experience. Could it be that experiences of becoming one with the universe are not delusional, but contain some veridicality, some objective truth? We generally think our mind is correlated to our brain and our body, but need it be like that? Could it at times correlate to more, again, related to the extended mind thesis? And if reality is in itself independent of the mind, not temporal, so we saw that the present seems to be subjective rather than objective. So objectively, outside of the human mind, if reality were then timeless, like a lot of theologians and philosophers and scientists like Minkowski, Einstein believed, could psychedelics give one an experience of timelessness? Is that even a coherent print? I thought. Interesting question. What am I next? 9, nature connectedness. Now, very interesting, and this relates to ethics. I think a lot of users on psychedelics say that on psychedelics, they get a conscious connection to nature. Psychedelics fosters this. Does that indicate, is that again merely delusional, or does it indicate something real? Does it indicate intrinsic value within nature? We generally, because of the West's trajectory from Descartes' philosophy of dualism and then mechanism, whereby we think of nature as completely dead, insentient generally, and only mammals perhaps as sentient. Is this, if we look at the history of that and question it, could it be that nature in itself actually has got more sentience than Descartes and the mechanists realized? And do psychedelics get us in touch with that real sentience, that panpsychism, as it's known? Spinoza was a great philosopher I'm writing about here. He thought that the whole of nature in a way was alive. Einstein was a great follower of Spinoza. Could psychedelics foster a greater ecological understanding through these philosophies? I'll leave that out there. 10, could psychedelics reset a user's cultural indoctrination? So we think of ourselves and think of the world in terms of, we're brought up in a certain framework, ideology, whatever, and we see our, grandfather's ideology was different from ours. We see other cultures are different from ours. You go back in time, you see radically different ones. And then you can realize, well, maybe we're not actually in right now. Maybe we're just part of a culture. It seems that psychedelics can rip one out of that. Octavio Paz wrote about that. Bertrand Russell said in Mystical States, one often goes beyond good and evil, so one gets out of one's moral ideology. Can psychedelics foster this? Not in a necessarily bad way, but what does bad mean? I mean, is that cultural? Anyway, again, these are just questions. 11, or is the psychedelic experience itself framed by the social context of the user? So we talk about these mystical experiences that we have, but is that just a Western thing derived from the sort of our Christian theology, Boethius, people like that writing about it? Or is it universal? So this is a big debate in religious or in theology, the antagonism between perennialism, which is like Huxley and James's belief that, you know, these drugs and mystical states through meditation or diet or whatever, they foster the same general experience no matter your culture or time. Whereas the contextualists say that no, context is everything. Everything you experience under psychedelics is determined by your culture. And then others say, well, no, your interpretation of the experiences inculcated by your social context, but not the experience itself. But a lot of people say, no, the experience itself. I personally think, I mean, especially with very strong psychedelics like 5-MeO DMT, I can't see how culture really has any say in that. But that's an interesting question. 12, does psychedelic experience offer a greater, less anthropocentric and more veridical consciousness of nature? Or do they ingrain particular cultural perspectives? So that's sort of following on from what I just said. That could be moral perspectives, that could be religious perspectives, could be political perspectives, whatever it may be. And 13, I think this is my final point, yeah, that many psychedelic experiences are ineffable then, so not able to be expressed in words. Makes one question the notion that language conditions thought, including the thought about ourselves. So in other words, do psychedelics give us new ways of self-reflection, thereby changing our self-consciousness, our self-understanding? So anyway, there's 13 questions. I better stop there. I don't know the answers to them. I've got some views, but this is topics for later research. Thanks for your time.